So, up to now, we've seen that religion constituted the city-state or polis, which was a loose federation of smaller pre-existing entities. We will now briefly describe the political institutions of the city, such as royalty, the magistrates, law, citizenship, colonies, patriotism, and international relations, as well as its social structure. The institution that came to be known as monarchy was that of the authority embodied by the figure of the king, a mirror of that of the paterfamilias in the family, a priest, a ruler, and a judge at the same time. However, we will see that this authority was far from being absolute in the cities, and when kings wanted to enforce central power at the expense of the autonomy of each family and tribe, they were fought tirelessly by this aristocracy. We must remember that the political institutions of the city did not appear out of the blue, because they were inherited from the clans that formed it. Words such as king, archon, and pritanis were all synonyms referring to the same person, the supreme priest of the civic cult, whose legitimacy derived from the religion of the sacred fire. Kings were always installed with a religious ceremony, which guaranteed that the gods accepted them, and it was a hereditary position. This ancient royalty was instituted by a natural progression of acceptance of moral belief, not by violent revolutions. But who was chosen to be king in the first place? We've seen that the city was founded as a federation of pre-existing entities, each with its own king. Usually, the privilege of royalty given to a particular family came from the link with the founder of the sacred fire that was venerated as the city's own, even if this family came from a distinct ethnic or linguistic group in relation to the people it governed. Religious royalty came under attack in subsequent conflicts, and it was deposed by a series of revolutions that shook the Greco-Italian world to its core and paved the way for more upcoming changes. During later attempts of restorations of the monarchy, happening mostly after the Bronze Age collapse and in the Dark Ages, the person who reigned often wouldn't style themselves king because they didn't rely on religion anymore, and would instead obtain political legitimacy through elections or by force, and be called instead tyrants. We will later see how these tyrants rose to power. Even with the appearance of new forms of government, the title of king remained highly esteemed, the legacy of a once powerful office. The public servants or magistrates who replaced royalty under the new republican system were, like the kings, priests. These priests would be judges and political leaders whose legitimacy rested upon the national religion. When royalty was replaced with republicanism, in a series of revolutions which we'll later cover in detail, meant that citizens could vote and elect most of the magistrates, but only the divine approval of the gods could determine who could run for election. This was sorted out by luck in Athens, whereas in Rome an election precedent interpreted the divine will. What mattered the most in the early republican period was the religious suitability of the candidate, which had to faithfully observe the civic cult and have a pure known religious family record with deified ancestors. And of course, all public servants were men. On top of that, notice how belonging to a religious family was a sine qua non condition, implying that the office of magistrates was reserved only for this priestly class. Primitive civil law derived almost completely from religion. In fact, one could say that law was essentially religion itself applied to everyday relations between people. This is because the oldest form of law in the Western world derived from a religious tradition and not legislative debate. Administration of law, therefore, corresponded to the pontiffs which prescribed divine formulae. Laws did not mutate. They were unchanging because they were considered divine. Strict performance of rights was much more relevant to law than a review of their moral principles. Words and acts were not altered because without precision in procedures, there was no legality in them. And, obviously, having access to a common law between two individuals required first that there be a common religion between them. Citizenship in ancient Rome and ancient Greece was understood as a man who participated in a city's religion. Only citizens of the same city could participate in the same law. Foreigners were never included and did not have access to the city's legal system, simply because they didn't participate in the cult. Just as a man could not have two families, so could he not belong to more than one national religion. One of the worst punishments for an ancient citizen was the loss of the right to belong to the community. The city could punish citizens with the loss of their citizenship, effectively depriving them of legal and political rights, making them foreign. This was called atimia in Greek, and was, for example, discussed in the Platonic dialogue of Crito, in which Socrates argues that he would rather die than disobey the laws of his polis and leave, for he would not be welcome in any other city knowing he had betrayed his own. Belonging to the community was a big deal for the ancients. Aristotle continually says that a man is a social animal, and the association of men is the way to live in a righteous manner by perfecting moral character. To be deprived of it means to be cut off from the possibility of living happily. He says so in Book 1 of his Politics. Therefore, the impulse to form a partnership of this kind is present in all men by nature, but the man who first united people in such a partnership was the greatest of benefactors. For as man is the best of the animals when perfected, so he is the worst of all when sundered from law and justice. The fatherland, in Latin terra patria, meaning the land of one's fathers, that part of soil which an ancestral religion had claimed and sanctified as its own, was the source of all social, religious, and political links between men. To be cut off from the patria was to effectively be cut off from society. These beliefs of a sectarian ancestral heritage implied that no political union was yet to be established amongst Italian or Greek city-states. The idea of empire, which grouped together all Greeks and all Italians, was a much later innovation. Even if smaller microsocieties had to come together to form the city-state, bigger polities than the city itself would only appear until the 4th century BC. Every relation between two cities was a confrontation of two religions, and it was believed that the gods were present in war, peace, and alliances. When it came to war, this was an implacable affair, because laws only applied to citizens. Foreigners were absolutely excluded from legality, and thus every cruelty done against them was legitimate. Alliances could involve a mutual exchange of religious and theological assets in which two cities developed a common religious link. So, gods could be merciless enemies in war, or allies in friendship. Often, this interaction made it possible for many cities to share common gods and start to develop a more open idea of the divine. And it was primarily through religion, that the first confederations or leagues made up of several cities began to form. An amphictyonia in Greek, was a confederation of various cities or tribes. Sharing a common cult was a sine qua non condition for its existence. There were amphictyonies in Greece, such as the leagues of Thermopylae, Ionia, Delos or Delphos, and in Italy, Latium and Etruria. They were not, however, a legislative body or a political union, limiting their common institutions to military joint actions and events such as Panhellenic games or festivals. Often, a shrine functioned as the heart of a league. When we speak of colonies in the ancient world, they are rather a different concept from those found in modern colonialism after the 15th century AD. These ancient colonies were not a subjugated entity, dependent of a metropolis. They were founded as a distinct state, but through the religious rites of the mother city, where the founders came from, the two polities were bonded in religion. Until the 5th century BC, the religious bonds between colony and metropolis remained strong, whereas the political bond was a posterior development. As an example of this, we can see several Ionian cities worshipping the gods of Athens, despite not being populated by Athenians, because they received their foundational sacred fire from the Prytanion of Athens. Like in the public and international sphere, we also have plenty of references which serve to describe how this religion exercised an almost absolute dominion over the private lives of ancient Roman and Greek nobility. This nobility were the only real citizens in the earliest times of the apparition of cities. They were known with their Latin title patricians and Greek eupatridii. Patrician has its etymological roots in the word pater, meaning he or she who descends from a pater familias, hence a noble, perhaps divine ancestor. Same applies to the Greek eupatrid, coming from the prefix eu or ev, meaning good, and patros, meaning father, implying someone who is high-born or well-fathered. Notice how the constitution of these societies functioned in a very similar way to medieval nobility. Birth marked a distinction between being recognized as higher up in the social ladder and being a commoner. This system of social hierarchization through privileges and castes eroded in the modern West, and it did too in the ancient West, in a series of revolutions we will later speak about. Amongst the patricians and eupatridae, fear of the gods and the rituals of religion governed everyday life and were present in all events, decisions, and routines. These people were under the grip of religious tradition, and genuine belief in that system can be seen in several testimonies that have survived to our age. This form of society deprived citizens of any form of individual freedom, as understood by modern standards. Lifestyle, education, fashion, military service, religious practice, exile, life and death were all dictated and judged by the state, without need to justify its decisions in moral grounds. Because applying tradition would suffice, there was no system of checks and balances in these primitive city-states. Religion accepted no authority over itself. Taking education as an example, we can see this in the laws of Athens, which prescribed all education for young citizens to be necessarily public and harshly limited private education, especially on matters of philosophy. Plato, in his 7th book of Laws, says clearly that the state wanted to have the monopoly on education and didn't allow parents the freedom to educate their children as they pleased, for citizens were a state asset. In this early form of citizenship, there was no individual with rights or personal freedom. Even with the transformation of the government systems and the social hierarchy that came with the revolutions, the limitless power of the state wasn't altered until much later. Hence, the emphasis Greek education placed in gymnastics and learning the traditional hymns and dances of the civic cult. The body was a weapon, and this weapon served to perpetuate the integrity of the state. Keeping religious festivals alive was more important than opening or answering moral questions. We know from the Apology that Socrates was condemned on the accusations of not believing in the gods of the city and corrupting the youth. How could he dare? After all, his mind and body too were the property of the state, and so were those of the young ones he was trying to cast away into thinking freely. However, things would not stay in the way they were first constituted. This omnipotent state, built as a religious community, would suffer many transformations to make it broader, more flexible, and more adaptable to the changing beliefs, and ultimately it would cease to exist. The process in which the Western world morphed from clan structures into more complex polities happened in a long time span, which began with the overthrow of royalty across Greece and Italy. It continued through the disintegration of the aristocratic entity of the gens, and then through what we'll call the plebeian revolutions, to finally progress into a fight between different political systems such as democracy, oligarchy, and tyranny. This would often have a local fight in each city-state, as well as a geopolitical theater involving new imperial powers. These revolutions changed antiquity and gave the Western world new substance and direction, while the philosophical revolution starting in the 7th century BC was planting the seeds for a change in beliefs from a theoretical point of view. Very physical changes started to occur inside each family and would later shake the city-state itself by overthrowing royalty, establishing aristocratic republican rule, dismembering the old gens, and opening the way for a new social class which would transform the West by bringing elements of equality before the law, a freer trade, and the destruction of the privileges of religious nobility, the plebs. These plebs, which became a middle class, were, and are, instrumental to the course of history. We'll begin rocking this world upside down in the next episode. Feel free to donate to this channel's Patreon to support the making of these videos. We will receive any donation from our patrons and sponsors with plenty of gratefulness, as it truly aids with our enterprise of popularizing historical and philosophical topics to reinvigorate the study of the Western tradition. We also invite you to leave a comment below and like and share if you enjoyed it. Stay tuned and subscribe.